when my father-in-law, Arthur, forced me into court to strip me of my late husband's business. He leaned across the aisle and laughed. "You can't afford a lawyer, Clara. You'll be penniless by noon." He genuinely believed he had backed me into a corner. What Arthur didn't know, and what his expensive legal team failed to research, was that I didn't need to hire a lawyer. Follow my story until the end to see how Arthur's arrogance backfired, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The courtroom doors heavy swung open, and the room fell completely silent. Standing in the doorway in a tailored suit was the top federal prosecutor in the state, who also happened to be my older brother. "My name is Clara. I'm 28 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed that love and patience could conquer any level of cruelty. I was wrong. For 6 years, I was married to Mark, the sweetest, most brilliant man I'd ever known. But loving Mark meant enduring his father, Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a man who measured human worth strictly by bank accounts and titles. To him, I was never enough. I was just the quiet, middle-class girl who had somehow tricked his heir into marriage. Every holiday, every family dinner was a masterclass in subtle degradation, with Arthur making constant remarks about my background, my modest job, and my lack of pedigree. Mark tried to protect me, often putting distance between us and his father's suffocating shadow. Together, we built a life from scratch, eventually launching Mark's independent software company out of our spare bedroom. But just as the business began to thrive, tragedy struck. Mark was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive neurological disorder. Overnight, my world shrank to hospital rooms, medication schedules, and sleepless nights. I became his full-time nurse, holding his hand through agonizing treatments and managing every terrifying detail alone. And where was Arthur during those 3 grueling months? He was entirely absent. He was too busy with his corporate investments to visit his dying son, sending only expensive flower arrangements that smelled like a funeral home. When Mark took his last breath, it was my hand he was holding, not his father's. Yet, as I sat in that empty hospital room, drained and broken, I had no idea that Arthur's absence wasn't just coldness, it was a calculated move. The funeral flowers were barely wilted before he made his move to destroy me. Exactly 8 days after we buried Mark, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Arthur standing on my porch, clad in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my annual salary. Beside him stood a sharp-eyed man carrying a leather briefcase, Richard Vance, Arthur's longtime corporate attorney. There were no condolences, no shared grief. Without waiting for an invitation, Arthur brushed past me and walked straight into Mark's home office, stepping on the threshold as if he already owned the place. He sat in Mark's favorite armchair, folded his hands, and looked at me with cold calculation. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Clara," he said, his voice flat and transactional. Vance placed a thick stack of legal documents on the desk between us. "These are transfer agreements," Vance explained smoothly. "Your late husband's tech firm, along with this residential property, are to be surrendered to Mr. Sterling's holding company immediately." I stared at them in disbelief. "This house is in both our names, and Mark built that company himself. You have no right." Arthur let out a dry, patronizing chuckle that made my blood run cold. Mark was my son, and everything he built was backed by sterling credit. Arthur spat, leaning forward. "You were just a placeholder, Clara. A temporary distraction. You don't know the first thing about running a corporation, let alone managing real capital." He gestured toward my modest attire and tired eyes. "You have no money, no leverage, and no family status to fight a millionaire like me. Sign the papers, pack your personal items, and take whatever small stipend Vance allocates you. Because if you try to fight me, I will bankrupt you before you even get a trial date." After Arthur and his attorney left, the silence in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. But instead of breaking down, a quiet, furious energy took over. The next morning, I began packing Mark's personal belongings in his office, a task I had been dreading. Tucked far behind a row of technical manuals on his bottom bookshelf, I noticed a small, concealed floor safe. Mark had always been careful with his private files, but I knew the combination. the date we first met. When the safe clicked open, I didn't find old family photos or sentimental keepsakes. I found thick, labeled folders containing years of internal financial ledgers, bank transfer receipts, and encrypted flash drives. As I read through the documents, the truth unfolded like a nightmare. Arthur hadn't just been a cold father. He'd been a parasite. Years ago, when Mark's tech startup began generating serious revenue, Arthur used his position as an advisory board member to secretly siphon millions out of Mark's company accounts. He had been quietly moving funds into offshore accounts to cover massive losses from his own failing real estate investments. Mark had discovered the embezzlement right before he got sick and had spent his final months documenting every single dollar Arthur had stolen. Arthur wasn't trying to take the company to honor Mark's legacy. He was trying to seize it to bury the evidence of his own grand larceny before the board noticed. My hands trembled as I realized what I was holding. I immediately dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My older brother, Julian. Arthur had always assumed my family was small town and insignificant. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived, gray and rainy. I deliberately wore a simple, muted navy dress with minimal makeup, looking every bit the heartbroken, overwhelmed widow Arthur expected to see. When I entered the county courthouse, Arthur and his attorney, Vance, were already sitting at the defense table, looking smug and untouchable. The gallery behind them was filled with several of Arthur's corporate associates, all brought along to witness what they assumed would be a swift execution of his authority. As I walked down the center aisle alone and sat at the plaintiff's table, Arthur leaned across the central divide. A cruel, triumphant grin stretched across his face. "You look lost, Clara," he whispered loud enough for the court reporter to hear. "I told you that you couldn't afford a real lawyer. Sign Vance's settlement before the judge takes the bench, or you'll leave this room owing us every dime you have left." I didn't answer him. I just checked the time on my watch. Exactly 8:59 a.m. At 9 a.m. sharp, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. The ambient chatter in the room instantly vanished. Walking down the aisle was a tall, sharp-eyed man in an immaculate dark suit, flanked by two junior attorneys carrying heavy leather litigation boxes and a pair of federal investigators. Arthur's smug smile faltered as he turned to look. Vance frowned, hurriedly shuffling through his papers, frantically searching for who this unexpected legal team could possibly be. My brother, Julian, pulled out the chair right beside me, adjusted his cufflinks, and smiled warmly at me before looking straight at Arthur. The trap was set. The Honorable Judge Callahan entered, took her seat, and adjusted her glasses as she looked over the docket. "Will plaintiff's counsel please state their name for the record?" she requested. Julian stood up smoothly, buttoning his jacket. "Julian Mercer, Your Honor, appearing on behalf of my sister, Clara Mercer Sterling. And for the record, I am Chief Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Arthur's face turned an ashen white, and Vance's pen clattered onto his legal pad. "Your Honor," Vance stammered, leaping to his feet. "This is a simple civil probate matter. A federal prosecutor has no jurisdiction in this courtroom." "Normally, that would be true, Mr. Vance," Julian responded, his voice ringing with cool, absolute authority. "However, this is no longer a civil dispute. This morning, my office officially unsealed a federal indictment against Arthur Sterling for grand larceny, wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion." Julian gestured to the federal agents standing at the back of the room. He then placed a massive stack of forensic accounting reports directly onto the judge's bench. What Mr. Sterling attempted to frame as an estate retrieval was actually a desperate attempt to seize control of the victim server infrastructure and destroy evidence of systematic theft totaling $4.2 million from his late son's company. Judge Callahan leaned forward, reviewing the unsealed federal warrants with a look of growing disgust. Vance sank back into his chair, looking at Arthur with sheer horror. He leaned over and frantically whispered to his client, "Keep your mouth shut, Arthur. Do not say a single word." The untouchable millionaire was suddenly drowning in plain sight. Judge Callahan's gavel struck the wood block with a loud, final echo. In light of the federal indictment and the overwhelming evidence of financial fraud, she declared, her tone sharp and unyielding, this court immediately freezes all personal and corporate assets belonging to Arthur Sterling. Arthur stood frozen, staring blankly as the judge granted every petition Julian presented. Not only was Arthur stripped of any claim to Mark's company and home, but the court also placed his own business under emergency federal receivership. Years of hiding his illegal activities had crumbled in less than 30 minutes. As the judge exited the courtroom, two federal agents stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from their belts. Arthur turned frantically toward Richard Vance, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do something, Vance. Fix this. That's what I pay you for." Vance slowly closed his leather briefcase, locked the clasps, and looked at Arthur with cold detachment. "There is nothing to fix, Arthur. You lied to me about the origin of those assets. My firm is withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately." Vance walked away without looking back, leaving Arthur completely abandoned in the middle of the room. The corporate associates who had arrived to watch Arthur humiliate me quickly slipped out the side exit, terrified of being linked to his downfall. As the agents clicked the cold metal cuffs around Arthur's wrists, he looked over at me, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and rage. But I didn't see the terrifying tyrant who had threatened to bankrupt me on my porch. I just saw a broken, greedy man finally facing the consequences of his own choices. 6 months after that day in court, the dust finally settled. Arthur pled guilty to multiple federal charges to avoid maximum sentencing, ending up with an 8-year prison term and millions in mandatory restitution. With his assets liquidated, every dollar he had siphoned from Mark's company was fully restored. I officially stepped in as the chief executive officer of Mark's firm. Guided by the brilliant team Mark had built and backed by a newfound strength I never knew I possessed, we expanded the company into new markets, ensuring his legacy would thrive for decades to come. Moving forward wasn't easy, and the grief of losing Mark still lingers every day. But living in our home with my head held high, knowing I protected his life's work, brought a sense of peace I thought I'd lost forever. Arthur spent years treating people as disposable, convinced that wealth and arrogance made him invincible. He learned the hard way that quiet dignity, truth, and genuine family loyalty will always dismantle a foundation built on greed. Now, I want to turn this over to you. If you were placed in my shoes during that ambush on the porch, would you have waited for the courtroom to reveal the truth? Or would you have confronted him sooner? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Dawn Forward, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the story if it resonated with you. Thank you so much for listening until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.